Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture that I think we've all been anticipating and hoping for. You have a very hungry audience here, Noam, looking for wisdom and I hope also some ways out. This is a part of a lecture series sponsored by begun by 4 faculty at the university, my colleagues Rashid Khalidi, Mahmoud Mamdani, Professor Eric Foner, and myself, out of a feeling that we really desperately need to have a vigorous, ongoing, systematic debate about U.S. foreign policy. And most importantly, we have to hear the critical voices now, because the critical voices have been right, and uncannily so, and because we're entering an even more dangerous period, clearly, right now. I think today's speaker certainly is the person that one would have in mind in the whole world in terms of being the leading critic and somebody who has shed more light on the issues of American foreign policy behavior than perhaps anybody else. All of you know that when you visit an English language bookstore abroad, it is a Chomsky bookstore with a few other books. And I don't know whether it's literally true that Noam Chomsky is the most widely read American author, but I'm almost sure it's true in foreign policy, and deservedly so. Of course, Professor Chomsky remade or invented or revolutionized, whatever term one wants to use, modern linguistics. And in a way, I think he has applied the linguistic tools to foreign policy to help us understand what we hear and how we think about what we hear. And it's for that reason, breathtakingly exciting to have you here, Noam, and we all look forward to your remarks.
You're hungry and we're not, as we just came from a very nice lunch at the faculty club. But the hideous crimes of the 20th century led to dedicated efforts to save humans from the curse of war. And the word save is no exaggeration. Surely, since it became clear in 1945 that the likelihood of ultimate doom is well beyond what any rational person would be willing to tolerate. Actually, the phrase ultimate doom is not mine, as a more interesting source. I'm borrowing it from 2 prominent strategic analysts writing in the current issue of maybe the most sober and respectable journal in the world, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, not given to hyperbole. They conclude that Washington's current military programs and aggressive stance, which have their origins in the Clinton years but have been accelerated very sharply in the last few, they say these carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, and they go on to express the hope that the threat will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving nations led by China. Okay, we've come to a pretty pass when such thoughts are expressed right at the heart of the establishment, and what that implies about the state of American democracy, where the issues don't even enter the electoral arena or the arena of public discussion, that's no less shocking. And as for what we can do, it's to overcome that huge democratic deficit. which may indeed lead to ultimate doom. Shouldn't be waiting for China to do something about it. It's also not comforting to read a related article in the same issue in which a leading authority on constitutional law discusses the concept of sovereignty that has been crafted by the Justice Department, articulating, as he puts it, a view of presidential authority that is all too close to the powers that Carl Schmitt, the leading German philosopher of law during the Nazi period, was willing to accord to his own Führer. And to add a bit more, the legal authority who transmitted Schmitt's view of presidential authority to the president also advised Bush to rescind the Geneva Conventions, the supreme law of the land and the core of modern humanitarian law. And he did so for quite sound reasons. He explained that if the Geneva Conventions remain in force, the president and his associates might be found guilty under the War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by the Republican Congress, which carries the death penalty. He's just been appointed Attorney General and is being described as a moderate. The efforts to end the curse of war led to a consensus on the principles that should guide state action. It was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Formally, the consensus remains, but it's quite interesting to see how the spectrum has shifted within intellectual opinion. It's shifted so much that the post-war consensus has drifted to the extremist end of public discussion and electoral politics. In fact, it's off the spectrum of electoral politics. I'll return to the post-war consensus and its fate and the current implications, but first we should take a moment to remember the virtual disappearance of it, which is quite recent. Just in the last years of the last millennium and the early years of this millennium, these were a remarkable moment of intellectual history. I'm not sure there's anything quite like them in the none-too-glorious history of intellectuals. Across the spectrum of articulate opinion in those few years, there was enthusiastic celebration, these are all quotes, of a normative revolution in world affairs, with awed acclaim for the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which had entered a noble phase in its foreign policy with a saintly glow. For the first time in history, a state is dedicated to principles and values, acting from altruism and moral fervor alone as the leader of the enlightened states, hence free to resort to force to determine for what its leaders determine to be right. So post-war consensus is off the agenda. That's a very small sample of an extraordinary deluge. I've selected only from the most respected liberal voices, kind of like off at the critical end of the spectrum. After several years of such rhetorical flights, a few events were brought forth as evidence for this impressive exercise of self-adulation, primarily the bombing of Serbia. It was regarded to that action that the phrase illegal but legitimate was coined in an unusually careful and sober evaluation of the bombing. Very unusual. I'll return to it. Well, in this atmosphere of self-adulation, highly regarded legal scholars explained that the framework of international law that had been established after World War II was just, quoting now, hot air. The grand attempt to subject the rule of force to the rule of law should be deposited in the ash can of history. The conclusive proof came a few years later, the same legal authority writes, and he's again on the liberal extreme, it became a few years later when Washington made it clear that it intends to do all it can to maintain its preeminence, that it would ignore the UN Security Council, over Iraq and would no longer be bound by the United Nations Charter, the rules governing the use of force. Therefore, the rules have collapsed, and in the winter of 2003, the entire edifice came crashing down, which is a good thing, he concludes, because the leader of the enlightened states, his term, must resist any effort to curb its use of force. Okay, again, I'm quoting from the liberal end of very distinguished international legal opinion in the leading establishment journals and a highly praised book. Well, these declarations do encapsulate with clarity and honesty what has become, in practice, a prevailing elite consensus. And it should be stressed, however, that these are not the views of the general public. Those we know, they don't get reported, but we know them from very careful studies of the best public opinion studies organizations, many of them last October, released before the election. Turns out that a considerable majority of the population believe that the United States should accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court, should sign the Kyoto Protocols, should rely on the United Nations to take the lead in international crises, including the specific case of Iraq, including security, reconstruction, political transition in Iraq, and the United States should even abandon the Security Council veto. It should rely on diplomatic and economic measures more than military ones in the so-called war on terror, and it should use force only if, I'm quoting, there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked, thus rejecting the bipartisan consensus on what's misleadingly called preemptive war. It's notable that it goes on like this. These views are held by people in virtual isolation. They very rarely hear them. Probably the people who give those answers assume I'm the only one in the country who thinks this. I have no other basis for it. None of this is discussed publicly in the media, the journals, except way at the extreme. Doesn't enter political campaigns, and only very marginally in opinion journals and media. And the same extends to other domains. I won't go into it, but it does raise very important questions in our own country about what we call a democratic deficit when we talk about others, meaning formal institutions but not functioning. The efforts to spare the world the horrors of war received their formal expression first in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which sought to outlaw war, but they took a definitive form in the United Nations Charter, which opens by expressing the determination of the signatories, I'm quoting it, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetimes has brought untold sorrow to mankind. And by then, not just untold sorrow, but total destruction, as all participants knew, but also knew they could not mention. So the words atomic and nuclear do not appear in the Charter. In the United States, the Charter is part of the supreme law of the land. Its provisions were spelled out further in the Nuremberg Tribunal judgments, which declares that initiation of a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. So, for example, it's in a way a mistake to talk about the extreme and overt war crimes that are being carried out in Fallujah, because they are simply part of the evil of the whole once you carry out aggression, and particular war crimes like attacking hospitals and so on don't really count. At Nuremberg, those who were judged to have played any role in the supreme crime, for example, the German foreign minister, were sentenced to death by hanging. The Tokyo tribunal was far more severe. Well, although the principles they enunciated were significant, both tribunals, Nuremberg and Tokyo, were deeply flawed by the most elementary moral standards. Their founding principles very explicitly rejected the principle of universality, the foundation of all moral judgment, which says that we apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others if we're serious, more stringent ones. That was all rejected very explicitly. They had to define war crime and crime against humanity, and it was crafted explicitly in such a way as to exclude the victors. It was not concealed. It was discussed openly that if the victors had carried out a crime, it wasn't a war crime. So the actual definition of war crime and crime against humanity for the tribunals was crime that you carried out and we did not. And to underscore that fact in the actual tribunal proceedings, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. counterparts had carried out the same crimes. Well, every subsequent tribunal is discredited by the same moral flaw. Take one that's going on right now, the Yugoslavia tribunal, now in session in The Hague. It's a striking example. A group of international lawyers requested the tribunal to investigate NATO crimes that were recorded by the major human rights organizations and other sources, in fact, even admitted by the NATO command. The prosecution rejected the request without investigation, which happens to be a violation of the laws of the statutes of the tribunal. The first prosecutor, Louise Arbour, stated right in the midst of the bombing that I accept the assurances given by NATO leaders that they intend to comply with international humanitarian law. So no investigation is necessary. Her successor, Carla Del Ponte, simply stated that NATO assurances left her very satisfied that there is no basis for opening an investigation of the NATO air campaign. Okay, finishes that. That's actually consistent with the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunal judgments. The powerful are immune by definition. Doesn't matter what the facts are, so there's no need for an investigation. Yugoslavia did bring charges to the World Court. That's also ongoing. It invoked, among other things, the Genocide Convention. And these proceedings do continue, but without the participation of the United States excluded itself on the grounds that when Washington finally signed the Genocide Convention after 40 years, it added a reservation excluding itself from charges. And the court correctly accepted that argument. World Court statutes require that both sides agree to be subject to adjudication. Well, much the same happened in the case that was brought by Nicaragua against the United States 20 years ago. A core part of Nicaragua's case, which was actually presented by a distinguished Harvard University law professor, a large part of the case was rejected by the court on the grounds that when the United States accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, it had entered a reservation excluding itself from prosecution under any multilateral treaty, hence excluding the supreme crime of aggression. The court was therefore compelled to restrict its deliberations to what's called customary international law and a single bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaty. But even on these very narrow grounds, the court charged Washington with unlawful use of force. That's a technical term that in lay language means international terrorism, and ordered the United States to terminate the crimes and pay substantial reparations, which would go far beyond paying off the huge debt that is now strangling Nicaragua. So there are indeed some very conservative ways to get rid of third world debt, like following court orders. The elite consensus dismissed the court as a hostile forum, a phrase used by the New York Times editors, reflecting the prevailing view. The U.S. reacted by escalating the war against Nicaragua and vetoing 2 Security Council resolutions that affirmed the court judgment. The targeted country was virtually destroyed, sank further into misery after the U.S. took it over again in 1990. By now, 60% of children under 2 suffer severe malnutrition, probable brain damage. That's a radical change from 20 years ago, when Washington was panicked by reports from UNICEF, the World Bank, and other international agencies about what they called, I'm quoting them, Nicaragua's remarkable achievements that were laying a solid foundation for long-term socioeconomic development, as the country enjoyed one of the most dramatic improvements in child survival in the developing world. No fear of that anymore. None of this was deemed worthy of attention as the wave of self-adulation crested and the perpetrators of the crime returned to office. Well, in the case of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the U.S. actually took no chances. Washington insisted that the tribunal exclude crimes against peace, that is, the most serious crimes, aggression. That's the supreme crime of Nuremberg. The U.S. insisted that the tribunal not be allowed to consider that. The reason was explained by the American drafter. He said that the U.S. did not want to establish precedents that might hamper U.S. military action, such as the invasion of Panama, which had just taken place and which had been condemned by the UN General Assembly, but not the Security Council, thanks to the veto, which prevents that. Rejection of the principle of universality is understandable. All you have to do is think through the consequences if we were willing to entertain elementary moral standards. So if, say, the United States is entitled to carry out what's now called anticipatory self-defense against terror in accord with the elite consensus, there's no disagreement about this. If it's entitled to, except for the public, but according to the elite consensus, we have that right. Then it follows at once that Cuba and Nicaragua and a host of others have long been entitled to carry out terrorist acts within the United States, because there's no doubt whatsoever of U.S. involvement in very serious terrorist attacks against them, extensively documented in impeccable sources. In the case of Nicaragua, even condemned by the World Court and the Security Council in vetoed resolutions. The conclusion, of course, is utterly outrageous, and nobody advocates that. And in fact, there are still more outrageous conclusions if we're willing to think. So, for example, no one would agree that would argue that Japan exercised the right of anticipatory self-defense when it bombed U.S. military bases in the U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines, even though the Japanese knew very well that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing assembly lines, and they were surely familiar with the very public discussion in the U.S. press explaining how these planes could be used to incinerate Japan's wooden cities in a war of extermination, taking off from their Hawaiian and Philippine bases. Notice that Japan had far better arguments for bombing Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, U.S. colonies, military bases, than Blair or Bush ever concocted in the case of Iraq. But no one says we should therefore go out and celebrate Pearl Harbor Day every year because of the nobility of Japan's foreign policy. The reason is the usual one. The powerful are exempt from moral principles, uniquely, because they so declare. Nor would anyone accord the right of anticipatory self-defense to any other state today, apart from the self-declared enlightened states, which have the power to determine norms, and they apply them selectively at will, while basking in self-praise. These are among the prerogatives of power in well-disciplined societies. The principle of universality has a crucial exception, and rejection of moral norms, moral truisms, the most elementary of them, is so deeply entrenched that even raising the question would be considered an unspeakable abomination. These happen to be our fundamental guiding values. Worth thinking about. Well, let's return to the resort to force. The UN Charter is quite explicit about what's permitted, namely when it's authorized by the Security Council or is undertaken in self-defense against armed attack until the Security Council acts. That concept is spelled out in the famous wording of Daniel Webster, quoted, that response to armed attack is legitimate when the necessity for action is instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, no moment of deliberation. Response under these conditions is preemptive war. Any other resort to force is the supreme international crime, which encompasses all subsequent evil. Domestic and international law are not formal axiom systems, and there's some scope for interpretation. But as far as human affairs are concerned, the meaning and implications are very clear. At the very least, they set a standard by which any resort to force should be evaluated. That should be conventional understanding, I think. It is not, however. It's off the spectrum, apart from the general population, which accepts this stand, as I mentioned. Sharp split in the population here between the general population and educated elites. That's actually been true for a long time. There's plenty of documentation for it, which I won't review. In brief, the idea that the U.S. should adhere to international law and its own constitution, unless very powerful justification can be given from departure for those principles, that's now an extremist position in elite discourse. So extreme that it's scarcely even mentioned in very crucial and obvious cases. Now, these, I think, are matters that should concern us, quite apart from their non-trivial connection to the likelihood of ultimate doom. The conventional position is that the U.S. has the unilateral right to resort to force when it chooses to do so. It's the position of the Bush administration, formulated in its national security strategy, but expressed clearly enough before 9/11. So in an article in Foreign Affairs, even before the election, Condoleezza Rice, now the new Secretary of State as of this morning, she condemned what she called the reflexive appeal to notions of international law and norms, and the belief that the support of many states, or even better, of institutions like the United Nations, is essential to the legitimate exercise of power. So she condemns that. By the United States, of course. The usual exception prevails, doesn't work for others. This extremist position is, in fact, conventional. She wasn't breaking any new ground. So I'll just keep to the left liberal extreme for a few illustrations. Elder statesman and Kennedy advisor Dean Acheson informed the American Society of International Law in 1963 that, in his words, no legal issue arises when the U.S. responds to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige. we don't even need any pretexts, in other words. He was speaking shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had brought the world close to the brink of nuclear war a few months earlier. An important part of the background for that, which he of course knew, was Kennedy's campaign to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. The phrase is historian and Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger, in his biography of Robert Kennedy, who was assigned responsibility for the massive international terrorist attack, which escalated in later years, actually continuing into the late 1990s. Well, that's Kennedy and Atchison. Clinton adopted essentially the same position. There was a Clinton doctrine. It advocated, I'll quote it, unilateral use of military power to defend vital interests, such as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, without even the pretexts that Bush and Blair devised. Well, taken literally, the Clinton doctrine is far more expansive than the Bush national security strategy, which declared the right to use force to dominate the world and destroy any potential challenge. The Bush national security strategy aroused enormous fear and concern around the world and elicited very harsh criticism, even within the foreign policy establishment. The more expansive Clinton doctrine, in contrast, was barely even reported. And the extensive literature on the national security strategy makes the difference clear. The objections had to do with style and manner of presentation, not substance. There's no disagreement on that. It was put rather well by Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in an article in Foreign Affairs. She pointed out that every president has such a doctrine in his back pocket, but it's simply foolish to smash people in the face with it and to implement it in a manner which is going to antagonize and infuriate even allies. So keep the doctrine, it's fine, but kind of be sensible about it. That's the political spectrum that we have. Well, continuing with the current consensus, the positions expressed by Atchison, the Reagan State Department, Clinton, the current administration, they also receive an instructive expression in the scholarly literature. That's a matter that's worth looking at carefully, particularly in an academic setting. So I hope you don't mind if I take a little excursion into this. There actually is one book so far, one leading historian, John Lewis Gaddis of Yale, who has just published a book that supports Bush administration programs with the usual provisos about error in tactics. The book was so popular in the White House, the New York Times reported, that Gaddis was invited over for a discussion. Gaddis is a very good historian, kind of on the liberal side. He differs from others within the mainstream in that he goes into the relevant historical background. He crucially with regard to what's called preemptive war. He traces the doctrine to one of his intellectual heroes, the great grand strategist John Quincy Adams. In the accurate New York Times paraphrase, Gaddis suggests that Bush's framework for fighting terrorism has its roots in the lofty idealistic tradition of John Quincy Adams and Woodrow Wilson. I'll return to a couple of words about Wilson's idealism, but much more important is Adams, who established the lofty idealistic tradition in a very famous state paper justifying Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida in the First Seminole War of 1818. Adams argued that the war was justified in self-defense. Gaddis agrees that its motives were legitimate security concerns. In Gaddis's version, after the British sacked Washington in 1814, U.S. leaders recognized that expansion is the path to security and therefore conquered Florida, a doctrine now expanded to the whole world by Bush, properly, he argues. So that's the story. And he, in fact, cites the right scholarly sources Gaddis, good historian, primarily historian William Earl Weeks, who did the most careful analysis. But he omits what they say. And actually we learn a lot about the precedents for current doctrines and the current consensus by filling in the gaps. So let's look at that. What does Weeks actually say? What follows is mostly quotes from his main source. Weeks describes in lurid detail what Jackson was doing in the exhibition of murder and plunder known as the First Seminole War, which was just another phase in his project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast, which was underway long before 1814. That had nothing to do with it. Florida was a problem, both because it had not yet been incorporated into the expanding American empire, as it was frankly called by the founding fathers, and because it was, quoting, a haven for Indians and runaway slaves fleeing the wrath of Jackson or slavery. There was, in fact, an Indian attack, which Jackson and Adams used as a pretext for the self-defense argument. U.S. forces drove a band of Seminoles off their lands, killing several of them and burning their village to the ground. They retaliated by attacking a supply boat under military command, and seizing the opportunity, Jackson, quoting again, embarked on a campaign of terror, devastation, and intimidation, destroying villages and sources of food in a calculated attempt to inflict starvation on the tribes who sought refuge from his wrath in the swamps. And so matters continued, leading to Adams' highly regarded state paper, which endorsed Jackson's unprovoked aggression to establish in Florida the dominion of this republic upon the odious basis of violence and bloodshed. Those happen to be the words of the Spanish ambassador, but as Weeks writes, a painfully precise description. Weeks continues, Adams had consciously distorted, dissembled, and lied about the goals and conduct of American foreign policy to both Congress and the public. If that sounds familiar, it's not an accident. He had grossly violated his proclaimed moral principles, implicitly defending Indian removal and slavery. The crimes of Jackson and Adams proved but a prelude to a second war of extermination against the Seminoles, in which the remnants either fled to the west to enjoy the same fate later, or were killed or forced to take refuge in the dense swamps of Florida. Today, Weeks concludes, the Seminoles survive in the national consciousness as the mascot of Florida State University, which is again a very typical case. Weeks also stresses the important point that Adams, his forceful endorsement of Jackson's crimes, shifted the power to make war from Congress, which is what the Constitution says, to the executive in violation of the Constitution. It's a principle that remains in force since 1818, not troubling strict constructionists, apparently. He goes on to point out that Adams's rhetoric also established, I'm quoting, the presidential rhetoric of empire designed to marshal public and congressional support for its policies, a durable and essential aspect of American diplomacy, inherited and elaborated